Trent, thanks very much for your time.
Very welcome.
I thought it'd be a good idea to plunge straight into the new record, Broken. And I really wanted to talk straight away about Wish, because we've got that in the UK as a sort of a single.
Well, Wish kind of came about last year. We were getting ready to do the Lollapalooza tour over here, the first one. And I've been toying around with the idea of this song that had that kind of shuffle beat to it. And threw the music together rather quickly, right before the tour. It was a rush thing, and it ended up being like the funnest song to play on the tour. And then when time to record new music, that was one of the first ones I wanted to do. It got a pretty radical reworking from how we played it live, but a lot of thought went into it for the first time. Clinical studio type thought that Flood and I put into the thing. Lyrically, at that time in my life, I was having a couple things distracting me, bothering me. One was personal situation that was occurring of, I don't know, I felt stripped down, and I felt as though that one of the themes on Broken in general is a realizing that certain things you've always kept close to you, finally one by one peeling them away, and one of those being self-worth, and just explored that avenue. Well, vaguely and around the point, that's one of the things that was bothering me and affecting me. The second was the fact that I thought at that point that Nine Inch Nails was pretty much over because of intense trouble we were having with our record label. And that basically was the American label TVT was preventing any sort of thing that I would want to do from happening. It just became a very unproductive situation. And any ideas I would come up with would have to go through this elaborate okaying process, to the point where making music or making anything to do with records was not fun. It was not enjoyable. There was quite an animosity on both parties. Anything I would want, they would not let me do, and have to do the opposite just because it was a clash of personalities and a general lack of understanding as to what the music was about. When you're faced with that, and on one hand, at that point in America, our career was skyrocketing. I mean, we were bigger then than I thought we'd be, and I'd hoped we'd be that big, 8, 9 years from now, thinking in terms of a long career. But in one record, it got to that point. I think Lollapalooza pushed us over the top. But to see that happening on one hand, and on the other hand, knowing that you're on thin ice because you can't, what I wanted to do, the kind of music I wanted to make, I would be prevented from making. Not only financially, but just through a process of, well, we won't release that. A lot of things like that. And not to harp on that subject too much, but it's a really disheartening feeling to know that your art is being stopped and creatively you're chained. And I think that shows up a lot on that EP. I just read a review where someone claimed that it was all about my record label and how much I hated everything, and every song reflected that. And I'd never consciously thought of that, but I think that element, it's definitely in there. That was a definite factor involved in it.
Do you think if you go through the similar situation again, say in 2 years' time, you're going to be better prepared for it? Do you feel you've gained any strength from the experience?
Absolutely. A final note on that whole scenario is it has been resolved to where we're now on a label in America that rescued us from TVT. That to this point, we're at the infancy stage of our relationship, but it's been absolutely great, and they've just done what I wished a label would do. I think a lot of some artists, I think, need some guidance from a record label. They need an A&R person to possibly coerce them into a direction that might benefit them in the long run. Some acts, I don't think, need any help and should just be left in a situation where they can do what they want to do, understanding that if you make a record that costs $1 million to make and it's has no potential to sell anything, that the artist is the one paying for that, essentially. As long as you go into it with some amount of common sense. I just am glad and now fortunate enough to be in a situation where here's a budget for a record and give me the tape when it's finished, and there's no interaction, nobody's picking singles, nobody's telling me what I can and cannot put on that record, or trying to push me in a certain direction musically, lyrically, anything like that. And Broken is a reflection of that.
It's interesting because Last and Happiness in Slavery, which follow fairly soon after, seem to have, for me, elements of hope or a certain amount of confidence.
Chronologically, Wish was written first, Last second, Gave Up, and Slavery at the end. Things had deteriorated, although fixed as far as the label situation. Just my mindset had kind of deteriorated. I think Gave Up reflects that. Slavery was less direct. I mean, I'm trying to improve myself writing-wise, because I don't know if people think, well, I don't know because I'm not other bands, but when I got into this, I did not have an arsenal of 100 songs, or 10 songs for that matter. I mean, I'd written 10 songs and they were on the first record. Maybe I'd written 11. I think I didn't. One of them didn't quite make the cut. But those are the first songs I'd ever written, because I was not a prolific writer. I didn't come out of this after years of doing demos and things like that. This is kind of the first thing I tried to do, mainly because I was afraid to do it, because I'd go out and buy a record and, you know, I could tell if a band, I liked it or not. But I was afraid to do my own thing, because if I couldn't do it, then it kind of ruined my whole life plans as to what I wanted to do, which is this. And when I started writing songs for Pretty Hate Machine, when I finally got the journal open and the pen going and thought, what am I going to write about? It just made sense to write about something I could speak about with authority, which is how I felt about whatever it might be. Maybe it might be a relationship, might be my religion or lack of religion, might be just things in general that bothered me, more so than things that made me happy, because if I was happy, I wouldn't be motivated to sit and write about it personally. Or take a very worldly, preachy, world-changing stance, which I didn't want to do and hope have not done, and will try to not do. So, as I just started writing and started liking what I was doing, I realized that a lot of it was incredibly personal and it was me. You know, what I was writing about was how I felt about something and my own feelings and my own experiences. And that they were all kind of in a similar vein, not happy, not great. When the record came out, the first album, I was very embarrassed in a way, not of what I'd done, but just of the fact that I was exposing myself, you know. But could kind of tell myself, well, it doesn't, you know, 10,000 people are going to buy this record, you know, at least I think I've made an honest statement. Then it grows up, you know, things started escalating, and it's kind of a weird feeling when you meet somebody and they read, oh, I totally relate to everything you said, and you know exactly how I feel. Whether or not that's the same thing, I don't know, and I'm just providing music. If you can relate to it, cool. I don't want to tell you exactly what I was writing about, because that might ruin what you've projected onto it, which is how I've always liked music. If I hear someone telling a story about, I didn't write it about this, I wrote about that, kind of deflates its importance to me. So I try to stay away from exact topics, and I also, when I'm writing something, try to stay vague enough that it could apply to a couple different things. Sometimes I think I succeed at that, sometimes I think I don't. Slightly irritates me when someone hears a record and says, oh, it's all about him breaking up with a girl or whatever. It's not. That's not what I was thinking of, but, you know, there's elements of that in there probably. In fact, I know there are, but it's not all about that. It's general dissatisfaction, etc. But back on the track of Broken, when it came time to write a new record, and I had not written anything for a couple of years. I'm not the kind of person that constantly is writing songs. I think that's one of my faults, since this is now my job. It was 2.5 solid years of touring, pretty much, which were very enjoyable up to the end, very educational, and I think the change, or the tougher sound of Broken versus Pretty Hate Machine, is a result of playing that many shows and learning more about real instruments, real drums, guitars, things that I didn't have access to when I did Pretty Hate Machine or know much about.
is Trent Reznor happy in hell? There is this kind of catharsis, this exorcism sometimes going on in the music for me.
I agree with you. I mean, I that's what we learned from the shows live was I tried to apply an aesthetic with the band, and we talked before the first shows and before almost every show. That I hate going to see a band where it seems like they're just going through the motions and they're playing these songs, they're sick of them, they hate them, that's the hit, so they have to play them. And I can honestly say, I'm not going to say every show we played is good, because we've definitely had some off nights and slipped into inconsistency towards the end of our playing, which the last shows were in England last year. But somewhere at some point in every show it started to kick in always, where it just made sense, and if the audience was bad, if they didn't like us, that was more reason to kick in. If the audience was great, it was like a mass exercising, if I could be so pretentious as to say that. But it seemed that way, and on stage it always kicked into a great release sort of thing. And as far as on the record, there's moments on Broken that I think capture that. For me, the end of Gave Up is my favorite part of the whole thing. When it finally kicks in and I'm screaming, it's kind of, yeah, it's a rewarding experience to perform it anyway. When it came time to do this record, and I knew it was going to be a mini EP or mini album or whatever it is, I didn't want to write a whole record that sounded that way. I didn't think I needed to get the point across. I'm very aware that it's somewhat difficult to listen to, and pretty much everyone I played it for before it was completely done didn't like it because it was too much, or the things they were expecting to hear in terms of melody or being able to hear what I'm saying weren't as readily apparent as it was on Pretty Hate Machine. And those were all conscious choices. Flood and I worked on most of that EP together with the idea of making something that was... I was in a very upset period, and I felt ugly, and I felt the whole thing was... I just felt crash and burn kind of mode. And when discussing with Flood, he was in a similar sort of frustrated environment. And I said, let's just make something that is irritating and is as ugly as I feel right now to be. That would be the truest record I could make. And that carried on into the lyrics, all of those songs, to reach the point where on the lyrics I hated parts of it and I couldn't get it better. And it was up until when I'm singing them in the studio, there was lines I was changing, especially in Last, that I just didn't feel were up to par. And I just kept coming back and back and was stuck, and there's certain things I didn't like, and I got a bit of negative criticism from one of the people on my inner camp, and realized that blew all my confidence whatsoever. And it was a really horrible music making experience all around. From the place we did those 3 tracks at a place in we did some pre-production at my home in New Orleans at the time, and then went to a weird studio in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which is a great place, I guess, in the summer during tourist season, but in the winter when we were there, it was The Shining. And it just led to this whole feeling of intense isolation, and you get out of the studio and want to go have a beer or anything. There's no one around. There's no place to go. There's nothing to see. The weather's shitty. It's just terrible. And it made for a really bizarre and strange, something I wouldn't want to do again. I didn't look for that, but it happened. But I think it made the record better. It made it more true. Now, I don't know that makes it better. I don't know that it makes it... It certainly doesn't make it more listenable, but I think due to some of my lack of confidence in some of the lyrics, I would mix them down when we were mixing. I'd put them back farther because I was embarrassed, in a sense. Some of them I really like, some of them I just have a problem with. And I thought, well, should I just scrap this track? Should we just move on? And this could sound like a cop-out, but I thought no, because this is true right now. This is exactly how... This is what it should be. This is a chronicling accurately of where I'm at this moment. And I don't think anything's terrible where I wouldn't have done it. but there's things where I wish I knew I could do better, you know, but I just wasn't able to do better at the time. So I think that's all part of. A lot of it could be after the fact justification. I'm aware of that. A lot of it could be. I'm not sure. It just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. And now when I listen to it, I like it. And those things don't bother me as much. And I feel that I've done something that I'm proud of and accurate. I think Pretty Hate Machine was very accurate how I felt at that time. And at that time and at the stage I was at and growing up in a sheltered area and living in a more sheltered city, when I did that, I thought that was a pretty bold record, you know. And as my eyes have opened up, as we've toured around, as we've seen the country, as I've learned certain weaknesses that that record has, and I've learned, as I've changed, I had to make a record that was as accurate as that one was. And I think I've done that with Broken, but I don't think it's necessarily as great. Not that Pretty Hate Machine's a masterpiece, but I don't know. I'm talking
Being aware
in
of that
circles.
process, then, do you think now that the business with releasing records, at least with the record company, seems to be straightening itself out a bit, and the fact that you've had a certain amount of sales success from the records, is there a danger now of you later on just now making a Linda Ronstadt album because everything's nice?
There's a real, it's a self-induced pressure, but it is one that exists. If Pretty Hate Machine sold 1,000 copies, and it was time to do a new record, if I could do one, I would feel less pressure because I would feel like I got nothing to lose, as I did with Pretty Hate Machine. It was a lot of it was just experimentation because I had nothing to lose. I had no expectation. I just wanted to make a good record. And that's not to say make a off-the-cuff junker just to do it. A lot of thought went into that record, as did this one. But when you don't have anybody, when you're not on the top, it's easier to not feel the pressure to, you know, outdo yourself. With this one, I mean, there was times where it was like, well, what did people like about that first record that made it catch on? And should I be concerned of that? It's hard to say no, I shouldn't be concerned of that at all, just going. But I don't think that I think I did the right thing. I think I'm going to bum some people out with this record because it's not a light pop thing that some of Pretty Hate Machine was. All the new people that have liked that record, Pretty Hate Machine, the people who have just caught on in the last 6 months, generally tend to like the lighter stuff that this part of us doesn't exist anymore. You know, that part of Nine Inch Nails is for the moment gone. You know, maybe some of it will return in some fashion, but I felt ugly. It was time to make an ugly record, and that was the truest thing. Luckily, people seem to now have liked it to some extent. But the 4 main tracks, well, actually, the 3 main tracks of the record, minus Slavery, were done. And I'd had a couple things floating around that I had intended to turn into typical songs like I just by habit tend to do. I'm aware of some shortcomings in my writing, one of which is thinking in terms of verse, chorus, middle part, 2-chorus, end, you know, which practically every song follows. And these were snippets of things that I liked, but didn't know how I was ever going to fit anything with them. And then just decided I like them the way they are, and I'll just see what happens. And was also aware that it broke up the bludgeoning of too many real hard things in a row. And I was trying, even though it is an EP, I tried to make it so you could listen to the whole thing as a entity, and it sounds like a piece of work. I don't like to write things that are, well, I try not to write stuff that is, here's 10 random songs I did stuck together. You know, I'd rather make it, here's an album, here's something that seems to have a beginning and end and a flow to it. And those 2 instrumental things, when I finished them, I think helped the typical flow of the record. I don't think they're genius, world-changing things, but I think they're kind of interesting, and as part of the record, I think makes it work better as a whole.
Physical is I suppose a cover version.
Yeah. What happened with that? Physical was another song that we'd played live at Lollapalooza that definitely was a joke along the lines of Get Down, Make Love, where we found a certain flow to the show where it starts off fairly heavy and mean, slows down, and builds back up to kind of a abusive but tongue-in-cheek level for a while before kicking back into the greatest hits of destruction and come up at the end of the show. Physical I thought was kind of a funny thing, and then it was fun to play because also it was a new track to play for us. But it was a one-off. I don't know if people got the joke or not. Sometimes we do some dumb things that I don't know if people get them or not, but we did anyway. So towards the end of recording the EP, which was done, we found ourselves with some time on our hands, some studio time, and my studio in my house was not built yet. So we went in and just tried. At this point, Flood was not working with us. Same with Slavery, which I did by myself. Wanted to experiment to see if I actually mixed things, how it would sound. And at the time, I thought it turned out pretty cool, and it was experimenting with guitars, which I'd never done before. That type of sounding guitars. We speeded tapes up and down and to get a weird sound. But I think after the fact, I'm kind of burnt out on that. I don't think it's a great thing. That and Physical, or Suck. Suck was a track that I had written for Pigface, which I liked the lyrics to the one that we did with Pigface. I didn't think was that great. It was unfinished. I do have a problem with Pigface, but we'll leave that go. I won't be involved with them in any capacity. And I personally thought that the whole Pigface project was a bit off the cuff for my, you know.
Do you want to explain very quickly what the Pigface project was?
Pigface was a kind of a collaboration between a bunch of people from different bands. People from Ministry minus Al, Skinny Puppy, Jesus Lizard, Martin Atkins being the main person behind the driving force of the thing. And when Martin had played with Ministry on their last tour for the whatever album that was, Mine Is a Terrible Thing to Taste, he was the second drummer, so they had two drummers playing, him and Bill Rieflin. They had so much fun during that tour, they decided to do a record of two drummers, kind of goofing around with Steve Albini producing. Then he would get guest people in to play anything. Then he asked me if I'd be interested in doing that, which I was. And it was a chance to meet a bunch of different people and collaborate in what was supposed to be a very open music arena. And I came through at the very end of the thing, where there was a couple snippets of drum beats left over and the studio time was run out. And I had some lyrics together for Suck that I had just kind of written that would have fit pretty much any music. I was very nervous because I'd never met those guys before. I'd known Martin before, but not anybody else. And threw together something in a couple hours, and Steve Albini suddenly said, "It's done. It's finally done. Let's just, let's record it and finish it and put it out," which I thought was not that great. And then upon listening a month later, really couldn't listen to it anymore. I didn't think it was that great of a thing. And listened to the old Pigface record personally. I didn't think it was that great.
So how do you feel now about collaborations or even someone else of a different talent coming in and remixing, or saying on a track like Wish, for example, I know what you're saying here, but I want to reinterpret that and remix it my way?
Well, when it's a thing like Pigface, I thought the idea was cool. I thought the execution was not that great. In America, it was kind of manipulated into people thinking it was going to be some awesome thing when it was just basically goofing around. And a lot of people tried to, I'm not trying to totally shit-can the thing. I just thought a lot of people tried to project upon it and think that there was all this great depth and thought that went into it when it wasn't. It was just messing around. I was there when we did it. It was very much goofing around, off the cuff kind of thing, which is fine. I don't think it necessarily has to be a heavy thing. But at the same time, I wouldn't listen to that record again. I just think I'm tired of it. What is then furthered again, there's been several other issues that have come up. And if you listen to Pigface now, there's not 1 ounce of music that is the same as what it is now. It's totally different music that I had written then Pigface went out and did a live tour, and I taught them all the parts. They did it. Of course, I wasn't involved in that because we were touring ourselves, and put their version out of it. And then I just redid it myself the way I wanted it to. But there's been some slight bit of conflict between just personality and people saying they deserve more than they have, and whatever. Anyway, as far as collaborating with people,
See, on Broken, it appears you've collaborated with Flood.
right, the main person I've collaborated with is Flood. Yeah, in the past with Pretty Hate Machine, I had a bunch of different people work with. As far as not instrumentalists, but as producers, mostly because I wasn't allowed to use other producers due to the record label, and I was convinced that I wasn't good enough to use anybody to do it with. And Flood was like a real pleasant surprise, and I thought we really fell along together and got along great. And still do. It was just a matter of time and everything for this thing that we didn't have enough time to do it right, and I didn't want to ruin it due to the fact we only had a little bit of time and trying to, rush it together. But the main versions of Broken, we had time to do. We spent time together, and we made it such a manic thing, and there was so much stuck into it that honestly, it wasn't what I had anticipated it to be. And in some ways, I'm a bit disappointed because it wasn't. I had a very definite idea, and when we started working together, it mutated into something else, which I think ultimately is good. It just wasn't what I thought it was. I tried to make a record that was total guitar, bass, drum, because I'd never done that. I'd never played a song that way. It was always based on some manic drum beat and something else programmed with something else, and then maybe a snippet of guitars on top. But this was something I could actually sing and play guitar and get the whole thing done. By the time it was done, it was a different thing that I think ultimately was more interesting and more bizarre, but it wasn't exactly what I had in mind. Slavery I did by myself, and the other two throwaway ones, Suck and Physical, were just off-the-cuff things I did by myself after that. But I've kind of focused into what I want to do now. I want to use collaboration as far as, on the next record tentatively, as far as people playing drums that I can't play, I think would be interesting, as far as some guitar players, etc. But I think I'm going to produce it completely myself just to see what happens, because it's always, it will be just me then, not from a point of megalomania, but as far as a term of just to see what would happen. It's just me. I don't want to stay that way, I don't think, forever, because I think that ultimately when you do have someone else to work with, your input will modify it and possibly turn it into a better thing. But for the next record, I really want to try it myself. As far as remixes and that, we're doing a version tentatively right now called Fixed, which is most of the songs of Broken with radically different remixes of it, and not 50 versions of each song like I'd done in the past of Mistakes, which I think is unlistenable. But I farmed out people that I've really respected into telling them without me redoing it myself. For example, I gave Jim Thirlwell from Fetus a copy of Wish and just said, don't do a better mix of it necessarily. Just change it to whatever you want to do and increase your input. Change it to whatever you think's cool, whether it's listenable or if it's atonal or if it's whatever you think is cool, do it. And I'm not going to tell you I think it's bad. If it's cool, let's see what happens. And it turned out awesome. And I did a mix with Paul Kendall of Happiness and Slavery that was cool, who I've worked with a little bit, who I think is great. And I just did a completely awesome remix of Coil with Peter Christopherson and John Balance. That was totally awesome. I'm not just saying that. I think it was great. Total pleasant surprise. I feel really good about it. And just to do an alternate version of some songs. If you like the songs on Broken, here's one that's just different version. Some of them are a lot more danceable. Some of them are a lot less accessible. The Fetus remix. And believe it or not, actually having Butch Vig do a remix of Last just to see what it sounded like.
Uh-huh.
And through all those, you learn from people. You know, it's like some of the stuff that Coil did. I would never have thought of doing that. I think it's ultimately pretty listenable and exciting, but it's not what I would have done.
Yeah.
And that's the way I'm looking at it. It's less hassle. It's more off the cuff kind of thing. I don't know who the people are that started liking us. And in the UK, I really have no idea who likes us and who doesn't. I'm not sure, because we don't really fit into a scene that happens in the UK. I don't think that we're... I don't think that what we do is fashionable, per se. I don't think there's a big movement of that kind of music that I know of, and I'm not that aware of what's happening over there right now. But I'm not sure of the scene. I'm not sure why people like us. I thought when we played there, we had a couple great shows, and we had a couple really bad shows. And we just disappeared as quickly as we came over there. We got some good reviews, got some really, really bad reviews. And I mean, it was a bit disheartening because I'm used to good reviews now, because we had great luck over here. But, you know, take with the good and with the bad. But I do think that a lot of comments they were making were quite unfair at the time. Again, you take the good with the bad, but it seemed like because we weren't a part of a fashion at the moment, that it wasn't understandable that we had to be pigeonholed to a certain kind of music. And people that liked electronic music, we weren't electronic music enough oriented, that we weren't purist enough to be pushed into some format. And it just was a difficult thing for some members of the press in the UK, I think, to understand what we're about. I don't know, you know. Someone comes at me and attacks and says, are you a industrial band? I don't know. You know, you're the one calling me that. I've never said that. You know, I'm not. Well, are you a rock band? I don't know. I'm just playing music. I don't know. I'm not the one claiming to be, you know, pigeonholed in some sort of genre that we don't live up to it because we put a new record out and then it doesn't fit what we were. And
but if it carries on and people start to pigeonhole you in areas that you really don't want to be pigeonholed in, and you start to feel that your music is being interpreted in a way, I mean, to take, for example, this is probably a crude example, but if industrial music became the theme tune to the rise of the new right in Europe, do you think that this would actually make you change course from what you want to do and change the kind of music that you want to make?
I don't think so. I mean, if something came out that inspired me enough to alternate or to just change the way that I would make music, if there's some form of music that came out that inspired me to stuff that it would change my whole attitude or my whole whatever, I mean, it would probably influence me in some capacity, but it's not. When you say industrial, I think the problem is that I don't know how I'm aware of the people in Europe in general are aware of what, you know, the origins of industrial music. Certainly in America, they're less aware of what the title of industrial came from. You know, if you talk about Throbbing Gristle or Test Department or a number of bands of that world that's not based on pop music or anything else, but truly experimental music, we're a far cry from that.
Yeah, I think people use the term industrial because there are sounds occasionally that sound like a machine, as opposed to a snare or a
right, which I think is a pretty juvenile way to approach something. In America, when bands like Front 242 or music or Ministry, bands like that, that was the first sort of any sort of music that people had heard that over in America. They needed some kind of title to the, you know, wax track stuff that was on wax tracks at the time. Now there's no real appropriate title for anything. We get called that. Every interview I see is called we're an industrial music or an industrial band. I don't know what that is necessarily. You know, I think we're a band that I guess we're kind of a pop band, but we use electronic as well as music, and I'm trying to make music that's not typical sounding music that sounds like every other band that comes
Yeah.
out, you know. As far as America, I think for the most part, this will probably sound pretty ignorant, but I've just from being around some people, some European people, they seem to be very more interested in the world and current events and the world in general, the situation, and more aware of it and caring about it. Whereas I think a lot of Americans have this false sense of security and a very much of an attitude of, well, it doesn't affect me, you know, everything's okay. Things might be bad, but it's going to get better, you know. There's no real threat anymore with Russia out of the picture. The chance of war seems to be far away than it ever has been. We're having some problems as far as the economy and some job problems and, you know, a lot of bad choices when it comes to leaders, etc. But it's generally this attitude of, well, it doesn't mean that much because it doesn't bother me. I see that. I'm also guilty of it to some extent, and I feel the more I get involved in working at music, the less I am aware of current events and things that I should know more about. But because I'm in a cave or I'm in a studio constantly, I find myself not paying that much attention to what's happening, and I am somewhat embarrassed of that. But I think it's pretty true as a whole, and I'm so uninterested in politics due to my lack of knowledge about it in general, that I tend to focus on my own little world, which is kind of an ignorant way to approach it. But it just seems so impossible to ever change anything here. Everything's based on such a system that is so unfair and unchangeable, and everything's about money, and those that have the money are going to control things, and nothing seems to be able to be changed here. And I think many people have just given up, that they don't care, and they just let the people that vote stay on that way, you know. I mean, there's been several things that have really, really irritated me. The way that America's treated the AIDS situation is inexcusable, to let it go this far, you know, and just let it go until it is a big thing. And just, it's from everything to do with that, from the way the medical world has reacted to it, to the government and their money, the way they've treated it, and, you know, what a great disease. It's a perfect disease, you know, it gets rid of all the undesirables, you know.
Yeah.
To the whole situation of the issue of freedom of choice, taking away the right for someone to have a choice to have an abortion or not, and seeing these complete idiots blocking, barricading abortion clinics, you know, claiming that that's, you know, right to life. That's a woman's decision, you know. It's so disgusting to see people who are just so blinded by the church, you know, so blinded by religion and so blind to everything. See them act in such an ignorant way, you know, thinking that they're actually, you know, living up to what God wants. That it just makes me so mad that I don't know how to reaction to that. I don't know how to act to that. Just hide in the studio, write about my own world, you know.
When I last spoke to you, which was over a year ago, I suppose, in New Orleans, you gave me a description of what the live shows were going to be like, which I think you surpassed really in the live show. You surpassed your own description. Do you have, as a sort of an end note, really, a description of how you feel the Downward Spiral, which is your album that you hope to have out next year, and obviously you're going to do more shows? Do you have a vision of a kind of path that those are going to take?
The record and the live shows, sort of thing. My idea for Downward Spiral.
The corny question is, hey, what next for 9 Inch Nails?
Right. the idea I had for Downward Spiral is one that was a record that had a theme to it and a story that kind of, without being pretentious, has a flow from a beginning to an end. And the general theme is one of just someone who's thrown away every single thing, every last thing, from a desire to fit in terms of a relationship or fitting in or a religion or any sort of thing to believe in, stripped away, and one bit by bit losing every single thing. And I've gotten the skeleton of about 15 songs that will, one by one, follow the deterioration, that starts at one certain level, which could start with the whole record business in general, which I'm disgusted by, to a very personal thing. I mean, it's vague at this point, but it's at the initial stages. And I'd like to make it something that flows as an album, not so much single-oriented or song, so much as a flowing from one thing to another. Musically, I'm trying to strip down things. I think Broken was an experiment into throwing everything but the kitchen sink into something. Whereas with Downward Spiral, I'm trying to make it a very seeming minstrel type record, or a very minimal is what I'm trying to say. A sound that doesn't sound finished. It sounds almost like a demo, but there's actually a lot in there. As you hear it, there's a lot of things that don't. You realize there's a lot of layers, but it doesn't sound like a just thing after thing. Like Broken tends to have layer over layer over layer over layer of parts and things, and if you listen to that 10 times, I think you can still hear things you didn't hear the first 10 times that are still in there. Whereas I'm planning on Downward Spiral to be a bit more minimal, less busy. And also, half of it, tentatively, is very aggressive. Broken style, perhaps even bolder, and half of it is a lot with no drums, a lot more, less going on, more ambient type things. And my goal is to write better songs and less typical type pop songs that I end up writing. Different structures, not always the same verse, chorus, break type thing. And the other idea is a bunch of short songs that will fit together. That might be minute-long songs. And I've got a bunch of songs right now that aren't good enough that I would typically milk into being 3 or 4 verses or 2 or 3 verses. Middle part, different breakup parts, just like maybe a verse, chorus, end, and maybe have 4 or 5 songs like that. That are the bits of songs that aren't quite done that adds to the whole theme of the whole record. All those are ideas I have in mind, as well as using a bunch of other things like a lot of real drums, thing like that. That's still an electronic-based type of record, which is my medium that I'm the most comfortable with, but also using things that I've never experimented with that much. Part of it is I have my own studio now that I can actually experiment and see if things work. I've always been afraid to spend a lot of time in a studio with, like I say, real drums, or a lot of real guitars, or with a whole band maybe playing at one time. Because if it fails in a studio, typically it costs X amount of money for maybe 3 or 4 days to find out, well, that sucked, and then I spent X amount of thousands of dollars to find out that it was a bad idea. It's kind of a cool thing. I'm trying to teach myself engineering and removing other people from the whole process, so I can see what happens. And it's fun, and it's also fun to try to figure out what I'm doing, which I don't know. As far as the live thing, it's a bit early, but I would see that the next time we go out on stage, one thing we were a bit accused of when we went to Europe, especially on the last set of dates, a lot of people thought that the show was really predictable, or a lot of it was all staged, or something would happen and some violence takes place, and we're just going through the motions, or we do the same thing every night. It's all part of a very theatrical type show. Some of that I understand, and I could see that we're guilty of that, but it's based on, I think, an honest thing. I think the next set of dates we're going to do are based more upon actual musicianship, better playing, less gimmicky type shows, less over the top type of great light shows and things like that, and just a band that comes out and kicks ass. You know, that here's the shows, and we're going to play them as honest and as mean as we can play them, and as sincere as we can get them across. Not simulating what the record sounds like, not being overly concerned about, oh, it sounds just like the record. I don't care if it does or not, but a good version of the stuff we have, in a no-nonsense, non-gimmicky type of way that's stripped down, and a lot of the older stuff altered to fit the way we are now.
Yeah.
Possibly I need another person in the band to play more. I need another guitar player, because I'm not really good enough to sing it and play guitar on this stuff. And rather than me fake it, I'd rather just have someone who's a better musician playing that kind of stuff.
Well, hopefully we're going to go and get to see that show in 1993.
Someday, yeah.